On January 28, 1986, millions of Americans watched as the Space Shuttle Challenger disappeared into a cloud of smoke and fire on live television. It was one of the most replayed 73 seconds in human history, a moment that would forever change how America viewed space exploration, high technology, and human sacrifice. But that was just the beginning of the story. What followed was a months-long search across the Atlantic, a heartbreaking recovery effort, and revelations about the final moments of 7 brave astronauts that the government kept largely silent about out of respect for their families. The bodies of these 7 explorers would not be found for nearly 6 weeks. The investigation into their fate would raise questions that scientists and engineers would continue to grapple with for decades to come. This is the untold story. This is what really happened to the Challenger crew. The morning of January 28, 1986, started like any other launch day at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The weather was cold, unusually cold for a Florida winter. The temperature had dropped to 36 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest launch conditions in the entire history of the Space Shuttle program. Technicians worked frantically through the night, completing their final preparations. Engineers pored over checklists. Systems were tested and retested. The launch had been delayed several times already due to bad weather and technical issues. Everyone wanted this launch to happen. The nation had been waiting. The countdown was on. Cameras set up across the country to broadcast what was supposed to be a routine mission into orbit. But this wasn't going to be just any shuttle launch. For the first time in NASA's history, a teacher was going to space. Krista McAuliffe, a 37-year-old high school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, had been selected from over 11,000 applicants to become the first educator to venture beyond Earth's atmosphere. She taught social studies. She inspired her students. She had a passion for learning and an adventurous spirit that made her perfect for this historic mission. She had left behind 2 children, Scott and Caroline, who were watching from home, wondering if their mom would really make it to space. Schools across the nation had shut down so children could watch the launch live. Millions of young people had tuned in with anticipation. The excitement was palpable. It was electric. Parents gathered around televisions in their living rooms. Teachers wheeled in television sets to classrooms where students sat in anticipation. This was supposed to be an inspirational moment, a celebration of human achievement and education. This was supposed to prove that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. The crew of the Challenger consisted of 7 remarkable individuals, each with their own unique story and background. Commander Dick Scobie was an experienced Air Force pilot with previous shuttle experience. He had flown on the Space Shuttle Challenger before on the STS-41C mission in 1984. He was 56 years old, a calm and steady leader who inspired confidence in those around him. He had logged over 2,000 hours as a pilot. Pilot Michael Smith was a decorated naval aviator and test pilot. He was 40 years old, newly promoted to the rank of captain in the United States Navy. He had the kind of steady demeanor that inspired trust in those who flew with him. He had flown combat missions in Vietnam. He had tested experimental aircraft. Now he was about to fly humanity's most advanced spacecraft. Mission specialist Ronald McNair was a physicist and trained astronaut. At 35 years old, he was one of the most brilliant minds among the crew. He had earned his doctorate in physics from MIT. He was passionate about space exploration and about opening doors for African Americans in the field of science and engineering. He played the saxophone in his spare time and had recorded an album. Ellison Onizuka was a mission specialist and Air Force test pilot. He was 39 years old, born in Hawaii to a Japanese-American family. He was quiet and dedicated, someone who led by example rather than words. Judith Resnick was a mission specialist and electrical engineer. She was 36 years old and the first Jewish astronaut in the history of NASA. She was brilliant, driven, and had overcome considerable obstacles to reach where she was. Gregory Jarvis was a payload specialist working for a major aerospace company. He was 41 years old and had fought hard for the opportunity to fly on the shuttle. This was his first flight into space, and he carried with him the hopes and dreams of his company and his colleagues. And then there was Krista McAuliffe, the teacher who represented the dreams and aspirations of educators everywhere. These 7 people had trained together for months. They had prepared rigorously for every conceivable scenario. They had studied emergency procedures until they could execute them in their sleep. They had flown in T-38 training aircraft. They had practiced emergency egress procedures. They had trained in the centrifuge to experience the G-forces of launch and landing. They felt ready. They felt confident. They had no idea that they had less than 2 hours to live. They had no way of knowing that the decisions made by people on the ground and the design flaws in the machinery around them would result in their deaths before this day was over. At 9:38 in the morning, the countdown reached its final seconds. The massive Space Shuttle main engines rumbled to life with a sound that could be heard for miles around. The solid rocket boosters ignited with a roar. The entire structure shook as millions of pounds of thrust pushed the shuttle upward off the launch pad. For 73 seconds after leaving the launch pad, the shuttle was traveling at nearly 2,000 miles per hour at an altitude of 46,000 feet. The acceleration was incredible. The astronauts experienced multiple G-forces pushing them back into their seats. In the control room at Kennedy Space Center, flight controllers watched their screens with the precision of surgeons. Data scrolled across monitors. Telemetry streamed in from dozens of sensors. Everything appeared nominal. Everything seemed perfect. The launch was proceeding exactly as planned, but nothing was perfect. Deep inside the right solid rocket booster, something was going catastrophically wrong. The solid rocket booster is a massive cylinder filled with solid rocket fuel. It generates tremendous thrust by burning this fuel under extreme pressure. The pressure inside the booster reaches 10,000 pounds per square inch. At the joints where sections of the booster are connected, massive O-ring seals are supposed to hold back this pressure and prevent hot gases from escaping. These O-rings are rubber. They're designed to expand and create a tight seal when exposed to pressure. But rubber has a weakness. When it gets cold, it becomes brittle, it becomes inflexible, it loses its elasticity. The unusually cold temperatures that morning, 36 degrees on the launch pad, had made these rubber O-rings dangerously stiff. As pressure built inside the right solid rocket booster during those 73 seconds of flight, one of these O-rings began to fail. The seal that was supposed to be impenetrable started to leak. Hot gases, at temperatures exceeding 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, began escaping through the failed seal. These gases began to erode the structures around them. The aluminum that made up the booster joint started to melt. The external fuel tank, which had never been designed to withstand such punishment, started to fail. A hole was burning through the structure that held everything together. No alarm bells rang in the control room. No warning lights flashed on the consoles. The failure was silent and invisible to the instruments that were supposed to detect it. The astronauts in the cabin above felt nothing unusual. They had no idea that their spacecraft was being destroyed from within. For 1 minute and 13 seconds, the Challenger continued climbing. To everyone watching, including the astronauts inside, everything seemed normal. The structural failure was occurring silently, undetected. Then, at 73 seconds into the flight, the structural integrity of the orbiter had been compromised beyond recovery. The Challenger began to break apart. What happened next was described as a disintegration rather than an explosion. Aerodynamic forces tore it apart piece by piece as it traveled at Mach 2.0. Debris scattered across miles of sky. The crew cabin separated from the orbiter and continued on a ballistic trajectory toward Earth. What the world didn't know at that moment, what NASA wouldn't fully understand until much later, was that the crew compartment remained intact during the initial breakup. The cabin that held the 7 astronauts didn't explode. It separated from the rest of the shuttle and began falling toward the Earth. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, that cabin fell through the sky. The astronauts inside would have experienced a tumbling motion. They would have felt G-forces acting on their bodies. The pressure in the cabin would have changed dramatically as the altitude decreased. Whether any of them remained conscious during that fall, whether any of them understood what was happening, became one of the most sensitive questions in the entire investigation. The official investigation later determined that the crew likely lost consciousness due to the rapid change in cabin pressure. As the altitude dropped and the cabin depressurized, the astronauts would have suffered hypoxia, a condition where the body is deprived of oxygen. It's a relatively painless way to lose consciousness. The theory provided some comfort to the grieving families. Their loved ones probably didn't suffer. They didn't spend their final moments in terror or agony. They simply lost consciousness and never woke up. But this was only a theory, an educated guess based on what engineers and doctors understood about the physics of the situation. The truth was that no one could ever know for certain what happened in those final moments. The Challenger crew cabin, with the bodies of the 7 astronauts still inside, continued its descent toward the Atlantic Ocean. At approximately 9:42 in the morning, the cabin struck the ocean surface at a speed of 207 miles per hour. Imagine that collision. The human body is fragile. It's mostly water. When exposed to such enormous forces, the results are catastrophic. The cabin hit with such force that it was effectively destroyed. The bodies inside were subjected to impact forces that pathologists would later describe as unsurvivable and unsurvived. The cabin sank into the Atlantic, carrying with it the remains of the 7 astronauts. The search and recovery operation that followed would become the largest and most complex military and civilian undertaking of its kind in the history of ocean operations. Within hours of the disaster, military vessels and aircraft were mobilized from across the country. The United States Navy deployed ships equipped with sophisticated sonar and diving equipment, including specialized deep-sea diving vessels normally used for salvage operations. The Coast Guard coordinated search patterns across vast areas of ocean, flying helicopters and deploying surface vessels to canvass every mile of the suspected debris field. The Air Force provided transport, logistical support, and communication infrastructure. Commercial salvage companies were contracted to provide additional equipment and expertise. Divers from the Navy's Special Operations community prepared for deep water operations in some of the most challenging diving conditions imaginable. Helicopters with advanced sensors and imaging equipment swept across the water's surface day after day. Submarines equipped with remote sensing devices searched the ocean floor. The government spared no expense and deployed every resource available to understand what had happened. The objective was twofold. First, investigators needed to recover physical evidence from the shuttle to determine what had caused the catastrophic failure. This would require careful examination of all recoverable debris. Each fragment would need to be cataloged, photographed, and analyzed. The evidence would need to tell the story of what went wrong. Second, and perhaps more importantly to the families waiting anxiously for news, they needed to recover the remains of the 7 crew members. The astronauts' families had seen their loved ones march into the spacecraft that morning. They had watched the launch. They had witnessed the explosion. They were desperate for closure, for the ability to properly memorialize their family members. The search and recovery effort became not just a technical investigation, but an emotional crusade, driven by the determination to bring the crew home. The search area stretched across hundreds of square miles of the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of central Florida. Debris was scattered across this vast expanse. Some pieces floated to the surface quickly. Other fragments lay on the ocean floor at depths of over 100 feet. Recovery teams worked methodically, cataloging every piece they found. The investigation would eventually recover 167 major fragments of the orbiter, accounting for approximately 47% of the Challenger's total mass. But the crew cabin remained elusive. Divers searched the area where calculations and computer models suggested it should be. Sonar operators studied their screens in darkened control rooms, hoping to detect a clear signature from the massive structure they were looking for. Days passed, then weeks. The families of the 7 astronauts waited anxiously for news. They held vigils. They prayed. They tried to find meaning in the tragedy. The media continued to speculate about what had happened and whether the crew members' remains would ever be found. The nation remained in a state of collective grief. The initial shock had faded, replaced by a persistent sadness and uncertainty. And still, the crew cabin could not be found. The search area was enormous. The ocean floor was unforgiving. 6 weeks after the disaster, the recovery effort had recovered hundreds of items. Parts of the external tank, fragments of the solid rocket boosters, personal effects, equipment. But not the object that mattered most to the families, not the crew cabin. Then, on March 7, 1986, Navy divers found it. Terry Bailey and Mike McAllister, 2 Navy salvage divers working from the USS Preserver, a Navy salvage ship specially equipped for deepwater recovery operations, were searching an area about 18 miles off the coast of Cape Canaveral. The water was dark and cold. The current was strong. The visibility was poor. Their sonar equipment picked up a large signature on the ocean floor, approximately 100 feet down. It was massive. It was the right size. Could it be? They descended slowly through the dark water, their diving lights cutting through the murk. As they got closer, the outline of a massive structure came into view. It was aluminum. It was spacecraft. As their lights illuminated more and more of it, they realized what they had found. It was the crew compartment of the Space Shuttle Challenger. The cabin that had held the 7 astronauts was lying on the ocean floor, relatively intact despite the catastrophic impact with the water at 207 miles per hour. The cabin's walls were crumpled, the windows were gone, but the basic structure had held together. Inside, still strapped into their seats, were the remains of the crew. What Bailey and McAllister found was a sight that none of them would ever forget. The remains were not intact bodies. Decades later, journalists and investigators would describe the scene with careful language, designed to respect the dignity of the astronauts while acknowledging the horror of what had occurred. The remains were severely damaged. The impact with the ocean at such high speed had caused trauma that left little recognizable. Some remains were more identifiable than others. But in general, what the divers found required careful examination by forensic pathologists to determine who was who. The remains were carefully recovered and transported to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, which serves as the primary mortuary facility for the United States military. From Dover, the remains were transferred to Patrick Air Force Base in Florida, where the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology had established a temporary identification center. The challenge facing the pathologists was immense. They needed to identify 7 individuals from remains that had been badly damaged by impact and further deteriorated by 6 weeks of immersion in salt water. They turned to dental records, medical records, and identifying medical procedures that had been documented in each astronaut's file. DNA analysis, as we know it today, was not yet an option in 1986. Identification had to be done the old-fashioned way. The process was methodical and respectful. Each identifiable fragment was carefully examined under laboratory conditions. Dental characteristics were compared to detailed dental records that had been maintained in each astronaut's medical file. X-rays were compared. Tooth patterns were analyzed. Old fractures or identifying marks were noted and cross-referenced. Medical devices that had been implanted in any of the crew members, such as surgical plates or joint replacements, could serve as definitive identifying markers. Forensic anthropologists worked alongside dentists and pathologists. They used every technique available to them. They treated each fragment with the dignity and respect deserving of these heroic explorers. Gradually, over days and then weeks of painstaking work, the identifications were confirmed. Each of the 7 astronauts was individually identified. The families received word. Some experienced a sense of closure. Others felt the weight of loss even more heavily. The nation received confirmation. The astronauts were found. They were coming home. But they would be coming home in a way that no one had imagined. And now the question became what to do with the remains. How do you honor astronauts whose bodies had been subjected to such trauma? How do you memorialize them appropriately? How do you respect their sacrifice while also honoring the family's wishes for privacy? NASA and the families consulted on the appropriate arrangements. The families requested privacy during this intensely personal time. Because of the nature of the remains, traditional funeral services were not possible. No open caskets, no viewings. Instead, private memorial services were arranged. The families gathered to remember and grieve. Some astronauts had requested to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, one of the most prestigious cemeteries in America. Others had requested other locations that held personal significance. Commander Dick Scobie, the mission commander, had his cremated remains interred at Arlington National Cemetery in Section 46 on May 19, 1986. Pilot Michael Smith was buried at Arlington National Cemetery on May 3, 1986. Ellison Onizuka, the mission specialist and Air Force test pilot, was buried at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii, his home state. Ronald McNair, the physicist and mission specialist, was initially buried at Rest Lawn Memorial Park in South Carolina. But his remains were later moved to a memorial park that was named in his honor. Krista McAuliffe, the teacher who had captured the hearts of the nation, was buried at Calvary Cemetery in Concord, New Hampshire, close to her home and her community. Gregory Jarvis, the payload specialist, had requested that his ashes be scattered in the Pacific Ocean, returning him to the vastness of the sea. But what of the remains that could not be individually identified? Some fragments could not be definitively matched to any particular individual. NASA and the families made a decision. On May 20th, 1986, the unidentifiable remains were cremated and commingled together. They were buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Section 46, near the grave of Dick Scobie. A monument was erected in their honor, inscribed with words of tribute to the brave crew of the United States Space Shuttle Challenger who had lost their lives on January 28, 1986. The memorial at Arlington became a place of pilgrimage for visitors. Millions would walk through the cemetery and pause at Section 46 to remember the 7 astronauts. Nearby, other memorials were created to honor the Challenger crew. A black granite monument was erected in Montpelier, Vermont, commissioned by a private citizen named Danny Roselli. The memorial stands isolated along a quiet road, a place for reflection and remembrance. But perhaps the most impressive memorial is the Space Mirror Memorial at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, the very place where the Challenger had launched so tragically. The memorial is a stunning structure of polished black granite designed to reflect the sky. Etched into the granite are the names of all 14 astronauts who had died in space accidents, including the 7 crew members of the Challenger. When visitors stand before the memorial and read the names, they see their own reflections in the mirror. It's a profound artistic statement, suggesting that we see ourselves reflected in their sacrifice, that their mission to explore space was ultimately a mission undertaken on behalf of all humanity. The investigation into the Challenger disaster revealed that the primary cause was the failure of an O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster. But the investigation also revealed something more troubling. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that manufactured the solid rocket boosters, had warned NASA that launching in such cold temperatures posed a serious risk. These warnings had been communicated to NASA management, but they were not adequately heeded. The decision to launch proceeded despite these concerns. The investigation would conclude that the disaster was, in many ways, preventable. It was not just a failure of engineering, but a failure of management, a failure of communication, a failure of the safety culture that should have permeated every decision made at NASA. The accident had profound consequences for the Space Shuttle program. All shuttle missions were suspended for 2 years and 8 months while an extensive review of safety procedures was conducted. Solid rocket boosters were redesigned. The O-ring seals were improved. Escape systems were developed for future spacecraft. Launch procedures were revised. Safety protocols were strengthened. The astronaut corps grieved the loss of their colleagues and friends. They vowed to learn from the tragedy and to ensure that such an accident would not happen again. Many of the changes that were implemented after the Challenger disaster remain in effect today in NASA's operations. The grief experienced by the families of the 7 astronauts was profound and lasting. Scobie, Smith, McNair, Onizuka, Resnick, Jarvis, and McAuliffe had all left behind families who would spend the rest of their lives without them. Krista McAuliffe had 2 children who grew up knowing they would never see their mother again. The other crew members had spouses and children and parents who had to endure an unimaginable loss, but their sacrifice had not been in vain. The entire world watched as these 7 brave individuals gave their lives in pursuit of exploration and knowledge. Their mission, though it ended in tragedy, inspired generations of students to pursue careers in science and engineering. NASA established an annual day of remembrance for all astronauts and cosmonauts who have died in space accidents. The Challenger crew is remembered on that day, along with the crew of the Columbia and cosmonauts lost in Russian space accidents. Their names are spoken, their achievements are recalled, their sacrifice is honored. In classrooms around the country, students learn about the Challenger disaster and the 7 astronauts who died. They learn about the investigation that followed and the lessons that were learned. They learn that even in tragedy, there is meaning. Even in loss, there is purpose. The bodies of the Challenger crew rested on the ocean floor for 6 weeks before they were recovered. In death, as in life, they remained explorers, having traveled farther than most humans ever will. Their journey ended, not in space, but in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. Their final resting places are scattered across the United States. But all of them are remembered. All of them are honored. The monument at Arlington National Cemetery serves as the central memorial, the place where the nation gathers to acknowledge their sacrifice. 40 years later, the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster remains one of the most significant events in space exploration history. The mission that was supposed to inspire a generation about the possibilities of space instead became a lesson in the importance of safety and communication. The 7 astronauts of the Challenger gave their lives not because they were reckless or unprepared, but because they were brave. They understood the risks. They understood that space exploration was dangerous, but they also understood that the pursuit of knowledge required courage and sacrifice. The story of what happened to the Challenger crew bodies is not a pleasant story. It's a story of tragedy and loss, of grief and investigation, of respect and remembrance. But it's also a story that must be told. It's a story that honors the memory of 7 remarkable individuals who ventured beyond Earth's atmosphere in pursuit of a dream. It's a story that reminds us of the fragility of human life and the importance of learning from tragedy. It's a story that inspires us to remember that progress sometimes requires sacrifice, and that the astronauts who venture into space do so not just for themselves, but for all of humanity. The Challenger crew will be remembered forever as heroes who gave everything in pursuit of exploration and knowledge.